No, thanks for having me, guys, and it's good to be back. So, what I'm going to talk about is just how, like, a few ideas around planning a pre-season, um, with particular reference to the current situation, because obviously we've never experienced anything like it before, and just to give a few ideas of uh, what we plan to do and what we suggest maybe looking into. So firstly, we need to decide what the aim of the pre-season is, and the aim of a pre-season is basically to build a foundation for the season ahead. In the current climate, it's expected that the pre-season we have is going to be fairly short, and you're coming off the back of a very heavy fixture schedule. So we've had some boys do 9 games in a very, very short space of time. There's also the possibility of players going straight into a heavy fixture schedule once again once the season starts. So we've got quite an interesting dilemma that we need to deal with. The initial part of the off-season will require our players to become more rested and recuperate from the exposure that they've currently had. And it's our job as practitioners to maneuver around this current situation. However, even in this situation, I'd say the overall principles of pre-season design doesn't really change. It's important it's designed within the philosophy of those within the club, especially from the management themselves. And whether a manager wants to utilise tactical periodisation, Behine's model of training, a form of undulating or block periodisation, the actual principle of pre-season will remain the same, and that's just to prepare the players for the season ahead. When planning the periodisation of a pre-season, it should be noted that although we create a plan for everyone, there must be consideration for those individuals within the squad who have an increased injury history or where a player is on return from the off-season, so how much running they've done in the lead up to their return. To maximise each player's potential, we must understand that we cannot place everyone in the same bucket, and we have to make slight adaptations to those who need it. We also need to be very wary of key progressions throughout the week, so understanding where the player is at on their return is key. And any progressions we do make need to be administered in a controlled setting. So, for example, speed progressions, I would always suggest that maybe the first time you do a max speed on the return to pre-season, make sure that's in a controlled setting rather than doing that in an element of chaos. I would also suggest that we would prioritise intensity, so the per minutes of the session, to maximise physiological adaptations whilst valuing the rest time between the sessions themselves. Additionally, we need to keep a close eye on game time to ensure players are exposed to what we would deem to be an acceptable amount prior to entering the first competitive game of the season. Whilst travel normally would be a key area, I don't think it's going to be a massive one this year, but that should be considered when you're planning your pre-season. With this in mind, and especially with the current situation we're in, off-season is going to be a key time point for us to get the players ready, especially with such a short turnaround and potentially what could come ahead. So like Joey said in his presentation, we need to think about the end goal and keep that in mind, because the end goal will determine what will be required for the players to reach in that level. Ideally, this should all be set from the final whistle of the last game of the season. And as mentioned earlier, the congested fixture list at the end of the season, mixed with the short turnaround, rest and recuperation will be a key focus once they finish the season. And especially key for those people who've amounted really high game minutes. Hopefully, come the end of the season, you have a return date in place. And alongside that, ideally, we want the players to be where they want to be at come the first competitive game of the season will determine the approach you take. Should the length of time not allow you to reach your targets, then my suggestion is probably focus on the off-season as an early stage of pre-season, and that should bring you closer to your targets. Then, as mentioned earlier, we need to be considerate of the individual circumstances. So what we plan will be okay for the majority, but minor tweaks will be needed dependent on whether they've had limited game time, they could play international minutes, or if the individual's returning from injury. When building the plan, it's very important that we actually use the experience within the staff structure to determine best practice to suit your team's philosophy and how to bring it all together. Each person will bring their viewpoint, and they all have different viewpoints on certain key bits of information that we need to look at during pre-season. And during this time, the collaboration and the communication between staff is paramount, especially in a time where around the wider world, protocols are changing on a weekly basis. I would also suggest maybe looking at expertise outside of sports, so you can get some great knowledge that's out there that can be applied to your setting. So for example, we've had experience talking to people within NASA, so dealing with nutrition on non-weight bearing injury cases. So obviously they have to deal with astronauts who have non-weight bearing because of the lack of gravity. We spoke to banks and their ability to analyze stock markets and how they apply context to their data. And also we spoke to retailers and how they interact with clients through messaging. There's many walks of life that we can all use and learn from different bits of information from, take them and apply them to our situation. Little bits of the information gathered within the group will apply to many of the players, but there will be the small adjustments that are required, so we need to tailor for their needs. Our job is to make sure that players are in the best space to build from, and this means that the off-season is a key time for us to create that foundation to build off. The off-season, and I'd probably say especially this year, requires a fine balancing act of the recovery and recuperation, whilst then preparing the players for a short pre-season block. Once the players have had that period that's suggested for the resetting, it's important to prepare the players for the oncoming season. Currently, we're unsure how the fixture schedule will begin, with every possibility that teams could be required to begin the season in a heavy fixture congestion. Because of these reasons, it's important that we understand the physical load that the players have been exposed to on return. During COVID, we used the Athlete Series unit, which we found worked really well, and that gave us a clear understanding of the load that they had prior to returning. As they could see each other's outputs, this also allowed us to create a leaderboard in-house, which then we feel enhanced their drive and their outputs compared to what was actually predicted for the drill that they ran, were actually higher than what we expected. For our running drills, we actually decided against doing long runs and limited the use of treadmills where we could. And this was basically due to the applicability of these kind of runs. So if we actually look at the image of a player jogging versus his movement in football, the continuous nature of a jog doesn't really happen in a football game. Yet we see players preparing to return to pre-season doing these kind of long duration runs. Football is made up of numerous changes of pace, and so would suggest that this is a key principle as you build those kind of runs in the off-season. Similarly, treadmill runs don't mimic the runs done in the game, with players likely to be asked to do either long duration runs or higher speed runs, so they're running at a set speed and they'll jump off the treadmill and leave it running. That's why I would suggest that looking into runs that mimic what is required for the team when they return to the pitch would be advisable, and make sure that the running protocols are specific to what will be replicated in the pre-season that you've designed. And this is where it's very important that we then work as different departments and bring everyone's thoughts together, especially within the vision of the management. Alongside this, I would also look at integrating the ball within drills as early as we can, because this can actually change the running mechanics of players and also adds an additional thought process, which isn't there when you're only running. You're then also able to integrate kicking progression, so then players have been exposed to it prior to returning to training. So the off-season also will allow us to work on any weaknesses that the boys have when preparing for their return. This time may provide chances of reducing any asymmetries that they may have when designing gym programs. We would also suggest that teams look at previous returns so we can get a gauge of where people would tend to return at. So for example, if you look at their body fat percentages or their cardiovascular fitness markers, and this should be considered to determine if there's any specific changes that need to be made for that player. We then want to target players returning in sufficient condition after the relevant rest period, so then we can push on once they return. Using feedback from what they're doing out on the pitch will allow us to adjust the plans. For example, in this COVID break, we saw players producing much higher than expected values with the runs we provided for them. And so we knew that players would come back in better condition than we expected. This meant we were able to progress the pre-season from the COVID situation a lot quicker than what we were originally planning. This was definitely helped by the competitive nature, and with the use of the leaderboard allowing to see where other players sat, that definitely assisted with what we wanted from the boys. So these are a few things that we would keep in mind with a team when prepping the players for returning. And it's more important than ever that we actually have to keep a close eye on what they're doing, and also keep in close contact with the player themselves. See how they're performing and how they're responding to the programs that they're doing. This will allow teams to be on the front foot and then remove any second guessing on whether they did it or how are they performing based on their norms. And I would like to highlight that not every individual will perform all you set to the highest of standards. And at the end of the day, this is the beauty of trying to find ways of maximizing different personalities to the adherence to any program that we set. However, by gaining the insight that we can do from the outputs that they give, we're then able to decide how best to attack what we're going to do. When they come in, we can then have a good estimate of whether the individual is going to be behind or whether they're going to be ahead of when it comes to testing. So that's an idea of some of the testing that we do here at Arsenal on day one when the player returns onto their pre-season. And basically we utilise this as a snapshot of where each player is compared to previous pre-seasons and where they're at compared to when they left us. The majority of our testing is actually done using tests we regularly monitor, and we try and do the same test that we do as part of our Matchday +2 protocols, with more in-depth screening analysis to assist with any adaptations that could be required later down the line for players. So, for example, as a baseline for injury. This data can come in handy, and it also can be utilised for providing a profiling for both strength and speed, as well as being able to longitudinally track how players are performing. So on a year-by-year basis, are players improving as they come back, or is there anyone that's dropping off from where we expect? It's also vitally important that we determine the right times to apply certain testing protocols. So, for example, with speed testing, I probably wouldn't advise doing that on day one, as we're not sure what they've done a few days prior to that, if you're removing any kind of running drills prior to returning, sorry. It's also important to decide on the choice of tests and also the order of the tests you do. And this will tend to be determined by manpower, so how many people you've got in your department and also the cost within your department. However, I don't think it makes much of a difference on how much information you collect, as long as that information you use is, one, useful, and then it has to be definitely actionable information. And then thirdly, you need to be able to repeat it in season, especially in a heavy fixture list, so then we can compare any changes that they're experiencing under fatigue, or if there's any changes that we need to be aware of. Finally, the information that we receive has to be able to be processed quickly so we can make a decision on where we go in. So once our pre-season testing is done, we try and turn all that information around the next day, so then we can have a debrief about how we're going to tackle certain individuals within the pre-season. On field, I would suggest you have some form of test that follows that too, which allows you to see how an individual responds. Ideally, you should decide to do an on-field test that you'll be able to do in season, and potentially one that you could do with a rehab player earlier on in their rehab to gauge where they're currently at compared to their norm. Because of this, I would have a preference to do a sub-max test. However, any testing that you do should be linked to both research and the philosophy of the team that you work in. So for example, one coach I've worked with wanted to make part of the running mentally tough. And so that year we included a maximal running test. With the results of the test, you then want to compare them to previous data against themselves, and then to see where they sit within the squad. So what we do here, we look at the CV response on a minute by minute interval, and then also looking at the player's heart rate in that recovery time once the test is finished. We also look at how they respond from a neuromuscular perspective, and with that, we'll look at dynamic stress load per meter. It has been shown to be a valid measure. However, I would like to highlight it is affected by explosive distance accelerations and decelerations. So we'd also include these three metrics alongside it, especially if you're doing a yo-yo test, because you can see that some individuals will change their movement patterns within that. If you see the dynamic stress load per meter increase and intensive metrics also increase, then it's likely the change is due to those three metrics. And they are probably likely to contribute a fair bit to the reason why that metric is increased. It's also been suggested that small-sided games can be used for testing purposes, which could be beneficial for those using a high model of training. In this particular study, they illustrated there are differences between outputs and suggest using an integrated approach, meaning you would probably look at measures such as heart rate and over distance. A few things we need to be aware of though when we're doing this, and I've pulled some 5v5 data that I had from previous years with the same player. Both 5v5s were 4 minutes, and the player had a higher heart rate in the second time the drill was done, and this must have been about two maybe 3 weeks after the first one. As you can see, both games have very similar distances. However, the heart rate response was higher in the second one. If I was only to look at the heart rate over distance metric, the player had an increase of 22%. And that value could lead me to suggest that potentially he's deconditioned. However, when we add in further information, we can see that the outputs have increased from an intensive point of view. And that's potentially why it's contributing to this increased response. And that's why it's paramount as sports scientists, fitness coaches, S&C coaches, that we actually look at underlying information around that before we make a judgment on a snapshot of data. Once we've observed how well the players have done and the planned running sessions from the off-season, as well as the testing results, we will determine whether the plan needs to be adjusted for the group or certain individuals, or do we stick with the current plan that we have. When deciding how to respond to certain scenarios, it's imperative to understand that how the player will react on a personal level. So how are they best at receiving information? How are they likely to respond under certain scenarios? This is where it's key that the soft skills we utilize come into play and we hit them on the nail. We also need to understand that the off-season is part of the pre-season. What is done in this time will determine how we progress with the periodization of the pre-season. Part of this periodization is determining how we progress aspects like speed. And when we do, I would suggest that the initial progressions, like I mentioned earlier, under an element of control before moving into the chaos of a game. And particularly when we begin pushing players into that 90% plus speed threshold, if they haven't done that prior to coming back. Within pre-season, we also want to try and keep an eye on the game time and any travel, though this is, like mentioned earlier, this is likely to be much lighter than previous pre-season, just so we can optimize players come the start of the season. As the pre-season is going to be much shorter, there is a chance that progressions in minutes will need to be much quicker than previous seasons. In sessions, look at working on both the intensity and the volume of the session. Looking to taper volume once we go past the midpoint of the mini pre-season that we will have. And the pre-season should work like a shock microcycle, so for the players to elicit the required adaptations for the coming season. Early on in the pre-season, we're looking at building volume and then bolstering the intensity of the sessions. From my experience, I've always found that players to be more robust than what we would think, and you can actually push players quite hard in this period. Just be sure you know how a player responds to the planned stimuluses, and anything out of the ordinary is when you may need to react to what you have planned. In this early phase, it's also important you decide on how you will respond to the results of the test. Do you push certain individuals more than others? Or do we get the ones behind to catch up to the level of everyone else? Or do we continue to push everyone based on where they're at? This will need to be discussed as part of your planning phase. You then also need to decide on how you want to tackle any double sessions or whether you want to do double sessions at all. I would suggest that if you look to optimize the hard work and the quality of the sessions, I would tend to have a preference of any doubles having the second session as a technical, tactical aspect, as this will allow players to be somewhat fresh for the next session. With freshness in mind, we need to decide how we handle recovery protocols as part of the pre-season. So whether your team decides to use ice baths or not, but we need to focus on optimizing nutrition, as we know that is paramount for players, and provide a periodized plan around what we have in mind for the training plan as well. So have them to mirroring each other. You then also need to decide on how best to provide feedback and to who. So this requires you to find out how people best disseminate information. And this may be through a debrief chat at the end of the day, or even an in-depth data overview. But like Joey said in his presentation, it's key that you understand how to deliver that information, because every manager that you work with, every coach you work with is different, and different bits of information will get through to different people. Some general ideas for early pre-season we want to look at is enhancing each player's conditioning. So for me, it would be extra for those who are behind, and whilst continuing to push everyone else as well, and just trying to bring them up a level as we go on. If the off-season's gone well, I would look to push on and maybe adapt what we originally planned, because the original plan may be lighter than what we would expect at the current time that they come back in. What we found is that possessions will increase your physical outputs. So if you start doing small-sided games and medium-sided games, you tend to see people jump into position. Within this, your centre-backs will sit back and your strikers will stay forward. This will reduce the amount of work they do, whereas if you have more of an area where they don't stay in fixed positions, you tend to see an increase in physical outputs. Again, we need to control progressions, so for example, the speed. And then I would try and maximise any football-specific work you have. We don't want to be taking the players away from the management. We want to try and support them where we can and get them ready within their philosophy. If you really need to boost intensity, runs are a simple addition. You can also do ball circuits, but decide on how you're going to do this and how you'll tackle this issue should it arise. I would also look to use mini goals. So I find this reduces max kicking, although there's the odd player who tends to kick the ball maximally in a small goal, but it does tend to reduce the amount of maximal kicking. And in this period, we need to expect soreness. Usually you find a lot of players have sore calves in this period, but that's to be expected, and that's where the nutrition protocols will come into play. And then with anything within the pre-season, be ready to adapt. There'll be different things that arise and different ideas, but be willing to adapt and react to anything that might arise, and be willing to push the players as well at the end of the day. Most importantly, make sure we have a plan in place for COVID. If the worst comes and the players have to stay at home again, make sure you have any running protocols that you can adapt, where you can make sure they have gym equipment and gym programs that they can do at home. And I mentioned maybe reduce the amount of treadmill running, but if worst comes to worst and they can't go out on a pitch, then that is better than nothing. And we get them ready for how we can and what we can do in these difficult times should it reoccur again. So in the mid pre-season, the aim should be looking to maximise our volume, build the game minutes of the players, and then also bolster the intensity of the training that we do. So for me, this period, you should be looking to hit the highest volume of work, enough time to taper into the start of the season. In some pre-seasons, I've seen players hit 7 games worth in extensive metrics. Now, I think this could be quite excessive, but it does show the kind of work that players can actually cope with. Additionally, I would look at providing drills that actually stress the players super maximally, and that's challenging them physically on appropriate days when you can do it. Match minutes should be looking to try and hit around the 70-minute mark for key players, and will be required to play at the start of the season once the competition begins. And I'd also look at maintaining any double sessions, because this is an easy way to bolster volume of key metrics that you have. I would also look to take up any opportunities post-game to top up the physical aspects that you're aiming to stress. So, for example, we have here a player who has 50 minutes of game time, and in this period of pre-season, we're looking at about 3 to 4 blocks of conditioning based on where we feel they're currently at, to add an extra stress to the player alongside his games. We tend to do this for those who've played anything less than 60 minutes. You can see this player, we've given him a bit of a hybrid of intensive and extensive load in the first and second block, with the third block looking at transition speed over shorter distances. We can see when we look at the metabolic power of these runs, that we've looked to increase the overall intensity in these blocks of work. The players are grouped into what aspects they need stressing for themselves, and then this will determine the kind of runs they do. Because of the increase in stress in this period, I would look to increase the amount of recovery you have. So potentially, if you're not using ice baths, utilise those probably more from a psychological perspective, because then they realise they've worked very hard, and then it's a kind of a mini reward for what they're doing. But then also primarily increase the nutrition protocols that the boys are being given. The general ideas for mid-pre-season would be to maximise the volume through conditioning around the team's philosophy. So again, is this ball conditioning? Is this through small-sided games? Or is this just general running? Whatever works for you and your team, I would utilise those kind of aspects. I would introduce high levels of chaos and high physical demands within the drills. So make sure that they're working at super maximal intensity within the sessions themselves and within the drills that are utilised. And then introduce your recovery protocols to assist those changes that you make. I would look to maximise time between sessions. So even if you have double sessions, maximise it where you can. Try and keep the quality where possible. Because as we're going to try and maximise the volume and bolster the intensity, we're also going to end up training under fatigue. And it's important that we train the players under fatigue at some point, because they'll be expected to do this come heavy fixture congestion. Target your key players for game time, so make sure that you're on the path to making sure those players are getting the game time that's going to be required come the end of pre-season. And then make sure you track those match minutes for game exposure. And anyone lacking on any key metrics, find ways of bolstering that where you can. Towards the end of pre-season, it's important that we measure how players are performing whilst giving enough time for us to make any changes that are required to assist in improvements prior to the pre-season finishing. The majority of players will be expected levels, however, there may be a minority that require minor adaptations to the plans in place. This period should see a drop in volume of your key metrics, with intensity of drills remaining high. If tactical drills have increased, it may be worth considering bolstering the overall intensity, as tactical drills can sometimes reduce the amount of intensity of this overall session. Training, we try and mirror the in-season training model around now, and game targets should be reaching the targets that were set prior to the start of the pre-season for all the key players that you've targeted. The general ideas for late pre-season is to try and retest the players at some point, just to track progress and see if there's anything that you could potentially be missing. That way we can try and affect what they're doing just before the competition begins. As we want to focus on players being fresh and ready, the volume of the session should be dropping. And if there's a drop in volume, there's a chance for some players, usually those with low game minutes, are not quite exposed to the required levels. Therefore, it's important we have plans in place for that. And an example of that would be if you come to the first competitive game of the season, there's people without match minutes, maybe look at playing opposition in-house to give them that exposure that they're missing. It's important that throughout this stage, we try and maximise the intensity when appropriate. And this will give a sufficient stimulus to those players. On this, I've attached a few papers that talk about the effects of pre-season and the following season itself. A number of papers tend to look at training volumes and have suggested that those players who train more are actually likely to have a reduced injury risk. However, I would suggest that we cannot be sure of the cause and effect. So it may be that actually that those players who are more robust will naturally do more sessions in pre-season. Also, be wary of using this information as a key reason to do more sessions or the amount of training volume that needs to be done. In my experience, the intensity seems to be a much better marker for the fitness levels of the players within the squad. And this is good, as the research paper on the bottom left has shown that to be linked with very positive physiological effects. It has also been shown that there is an increase in the tactical synchronization with the team when comparing the start to the end of the pre-season, which is to be expected as the players get more time with the coaches in this period. And this definitely highlights the actual needs that we make sure we provide a service to the management themselves and ensure that the players get optimum time in front of them to get their messages across. Blending the coaching, the sports science and the medical input within the pre-season preparation is likely going to be the most successful plan. And again, this comes back to the key point that the collaboration between different individuals within the department is going to be key to any success. With times like these, the collaboration and the communication is paramount, because if the worst case happens again, we need to make sure players and their families are well and everyone is coping with these strange times we're currently in. Make sure that you have a plan in place if the worst does happen and they are required to work from home. And those, we also need to take into consideration that in the pre-season, you may have a player be tested positive for COVID. And what will you do should that happen? After the heavy fixture schedule, it's important to provide sufficient rest from both the physiological and psychological perspective. And due to the short turnaround, it's important you have a method to see how players are doing in the off-season. And it's probably more important than ever that we actually have a way of recording the objective information for what they're doing whilst away from us. It's also important we consider the players in this too. So I would suggest you speak to the leaders within your environment and about their thoughts and how they would develop a plan. Every now and then you get some players come up with some very good ideas, and they definitely see it from a different perspective to what we do. Additionally, as it's something we've never experienced before, it's important that we as practitioners continue to discuss, challenge each other, collaborate with ideas and try to improve the industry and keep it moving forward. I think it's something that has been a key part of this period of time, and I think people have become more open, sharing the information they have. And yeah, that's the key point for us all, being better practitioners at the end of the day. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me, and please feel free to reach out and ask me any questions you may have. Willing to collaborate with people.
Cheers for that, Tom. Thanks a million. Lots of really good nuggets there of information and things for people to consider when planning their own sort of pre-season return to play. You know, I suppose it's something that I had spoken to a lot of our own clients about, you know, in the past, was monitoring players when they were away and planning and how they would monitor, but that was more so in a case of international break or something like that, whereas no one was expecting players, I suppose, to be away for as long as they were. And yeah, just really what you said there too is about having a plan in place for should another wave of COVID hit or whatever the case is that now I suppose people have no excuse but to be planning for that and preparing for that.
Yeah.
Just one quick question for you here has came in. So it's, what strategies do you adopt if a first team player returns late to pre-season? So I imagine if they're injured or something like that, or they're playing in another competition or something, what do you do in that situation?
So again, then you look at the previous load they've been exposed to. So decide on the amount of rest you feel is needed for that individual. If they return, say, a week or 2 weeks after the squad of players that have initially come in, you have to be aware you cannot throw them in to the same intensity all the time. So, for instance, you can get them to train with the squad, but you might adapt the session so there might be a floater. And then if you're in a week where you're starting to reduce the volume, you may look to build up that individual's volume. A lot of it comes down to working as a group of sports scientists, medical practitioners, S&C coaches, to suggest where they're at, and if you've got any objective information to them prior to coming, you've got a better idea than just guessing what they've been doing. And then it's also understanding what that individual will respond like. So is it a fairly robust player, or is it a player who's more prone to having issues that could arise? And I think that's unfortunately the answer to that is it depends on the
a broad question, but
yeah.
No, cheers for that, Tom. Okay, well, look, thanks a million for taking the time to come on, and I suppose best of luck going forward in the FA Cup final week after next.
Cheers, thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
No problem. So Tom's presentation will be available on our YouTube channel, and as I said, his previous presentation from webinar 1 is up there as well.